It's a Saturday night, and he's excited for a night on the town. He dresses in a pair of nice jeans and a going-out shirt. His friends will be there, the cute bartender, and maybe even someone special, even if it's just for the night. Once upon a time, he couldn't have done this, gone out as an openly gay man to enjoy the nightlife of Indianapolis, Indiana, or anywhere for that matter. But this is the 90s, and the world is changing. It's safe now to be who you are. At the bar, the music is loud. A moderately handsome guy, a little out of place in a button-down shirt, catches his eye and buys him a drink. He's curious about this stranger, who tells him about his beautiful house with a pool in the basement. The stranger invites him back for a drink. He says yes and follows the stranger out the door and into the warm summer night. He does not know that he's walking toward his death. He will never be seen again. How many young men died at the hands of Herb Baumeister is a mystery to this day. The numbers hover somewhere between 15 and 20, although it could be much more. One thing is certain. A sadistic serial killer hunted for years from the comfort of the carefully crafted facade he'd built around himself as a husband, a family man, and a business owner. He laughed and smiled while in his backyard bodies lay rotting. The families of those men lay awake at night wondering, and Herb himself remained hidden in plain sight. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. This episode of Bitter Endings is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in ebook, audiobook, and paperback. Just search the Northern Michigan Asylum series. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. As I researched the story of the murders at the Fox Hollow Farm, I struggled with how to piece it together and present it in this podcast. I prefer to start with the victim, for the emphasis to be on their story. However, in this case, the victims were many, and the information about them was scant. Still, I will start there and offer what I can on at least some of the lives of the men who were cut terribly short at the hands of Herb Baumeister. I will talk about Herb himself as well. This is going to be a two-part podcast. As I've mentioned before, I write paranormal fiction. I'm curious about places that are considered haunted. Fox Hollow Farm is very much one of those places. The second half of this two-part podcast, which will come out next week, will cover the hauntings that have been reported there. This first half will cover the murders and the history of Herb Baumeister himself. Ultimately, what I'm talking about here is the story of more than a dozen murders. And just think about that for a moment. For every single death, there's a family stretching out like tree branches from a trunk. We can't see how deep those roots go, how connected they are. We can't see who else dies as a result of that death, the death of friendship, of happiness, of hope. It's kind of the missing link in true crime, the absolute devastation for friends and family that accompanies the death of one person, and in this case we have a dozen or more. In the early 90s, downtown Indianapolis was a popular place to be. The gay community had a thriving nightlife, and one that hadn't come easy. A decade before, bars that catered to the LGBTQ community were often harassed by police. under regular surveillance, and even raided. For gay men and women, the bars offered one of the only spaces they could be open about their sexuality, but that openness could also be dangerous. On the Indiana History blog, gay rights activist Mike Stotler described police harassment at a gay bar in Indianapolis. Quote, "You can be in the bar for maybe just 1 hour and be asked to present ID to a police officer 4 or 5 times. The police also routinely copy down license plate numbers in an attempt to intimidate the bar's patrons." The blog goes on to describe the murders of multiple gay men whose deaths were largely written off because they were gay and had been murdered or disappeared in areas where gay prostitution often occurred. Mind you, in the quote, Mike was referring to a period of time before the 90s, in the 70s and 80s, but it wasn't all that far gone. And I think this is an important piece of the history and the murders that happened in Indianapolis in the early 90s, because this sort of collective disregard for human beings who are involved in activities like prostitution is part of what allowed Herb Baumeister to get away with murder for over a decade. And it's not an injustice isolated to Indiana. We see it all over the world, the sense that prostitute murders are somehow less horrendous than other kinds. But the truth at the heart of these murders is there is a human being who is loved, missed, and mourned after they're gone. It's hard to pinpoint a date when the murders started. You'll come to understand why once you've listened to the podcast. Young men began disappearing from Indianapolis as early as 1980, but it wouldn't be until 1994 that the unraveling of this heinous serial killer would finally begin. From 1980 until 1991, 9 young gay men were found murdered along the I-70 and I-35 corridors in Indiana and Ohio. In 1991, the killings seemed to have stopped, but the disappearances had not. Young men were still vanishing from downtown Indianapolis. People who were part of the LGBTQ community in Indianapolis were aware of this and warned each other to be careful. However, the disappearances were not covered by the mainstream media, and many people were simply unaware of them. In June of 1994, Virgil Vandegrift, a private investigator and former sheriff of Marion County, was contacted by a woman who said her 28-year-old son, Alan Broussard, was missing. Alan was gay, a heavy drinker, and had last been seen leaving the bar Brothers in downtown Indianapolis. He hadn't been heard from since June 6th, and Alan's mother was convinced that something terrible had happened to him. He started looking into Alan's last whereabouts. He discovered that an Indianapolis detective named Mary Wilson was also looking into the disappearances of other young gay men from Indianapolis. These men were close to the same age as Alan, and some of them even looked similar. As Vandegrift investigated, his unease grew when he came upon an article in a gay lifestyle magazine called Indiana World, which covered the vanishing of a man named Jeff Jones. Jeff, also gay, had disappeared a year earlier in 1993 from the streets of Indianapolis. Not a trace of the man had been found. Weeks later, Vandegrift became convinced a serial killer was in their midst. The mother of 33-year-old Roger Goodlett reached out regarding the disappearance of her son. He'd left his mother's home to visit a gay bar on 16th Street in Indianapolis. Roger was never seen again. Virgil started posting flyers at downtown gay bars and interviewing the friends and family of the missing men. He was contacted by a publisher of a gay magazine who alerted Virgil to the fact that far more than 2 gay men had gone missing or been murdered in the Indianapolis area in the previous years. The more Virgil looked, the more he became concerned that a predator was preying on young men in Indiana. Virgil also got tips by several people who saw Roger Goodlet getting into a blue vehicle with Ohio license plates the night he disappeared in downtown Indianapolis. Still, he had few clues to go on until a man named Mark reached out to tell him a chilling story. Mark was a friend of Roger Goodlet, the man who'd vanished on July 8th. According to Mark, he'd gone into a gay club in downtown Indianapolis and noticed a man staring at a missing poster for his friend Roger. The man seemed oddly enthralled by the poster, and Mark had the strange feeling that the man knew what happened to his missing friend. Mark approached him, and the man introduced himself as Brian Smart, a landscaper from Ohio. They chatted for a while, and Smart invited Mark back to a house he was temporarily staying at. Smart said it belonged to a person he was doing work for, and it had a pool in the basement. They could go for a swim. Mark, wanting to get more information about his missing friend, agreed to accompany the man. Mark got into Smart's car, which was a Buick with Ohio license plates. They drove into the country where there were sprawling farms and ranches. They turned at a sign that said something farm and drove down a dark, winding driveway, ending at a two-door mansion. Smart led Mark to the basement of the home, where there was an in-ground swimming pool and oddly mannequins surrounding it. As they talked and swam, Smart brought up autoerotic asphyxiation, or being choked to receive sexual pleasure. Smart asked Mark to choke him with a pool hose while he masturbated. Mark did it, and then Smart wanted to do the same thing to Mark, and Mark agreed. And you may be finding this rather strange. I know that I did. Not simply the act itself, which is also strange, but the fact that Mark was allowing this man, Brian Smart, who he believed may have murdered his friend, wrap a hose around his neck in a pool and potentially kill him as well. In any case, Mark went along with it, and Smart didn't release him for a very long time, so Mark pretended to pass out. He acted as if he went unconscious in the pool. Smart let him go. When Mark opened his eyes, Smart acted as if he were upset and worried that Mark had passed out. Shortly after the experience, Brian Smart drove Mark back to Indianapolis. The evening had terrified Mark, and he reached out to law enforcement and told them the story. However, he didn't remember the exact location of the house, nor the man's license plate number, so they had little to go on. Investigators were stymied. Not only were there men currently disappearing from Indianapolis, but other counties had similar disappearances and murders of young gay men, and it was becoming increasingly clear that they were likely linked. The FBI was asked to create a profile of the likely killer. They stated the man was a white male in his 40s who likely started killing in his late 20s to early 30s. He may have been previously or currently married, but the marriage was likely failing. He may have an above-average IQ, though he likely worked below his intelligence. He was also likely frustrated with his homosexual tendencies. As time went on, investigators attempted to locate the farm described by Mark, but they were unable to. Some period of time, and I found differing results on this, but I think it was around a year, but it might have been more than a year, after Mark first met Brian Smart, he encountered him again at a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis. Afraid to go himself, Mark asked a friend to walk to the parking lot and get Brian's license plate number, which he did. The license plate number was given to investigators who pulled the information regarding the owner. It came back as belonging to Herbert Baumeister. Herb Baumeister was born in Indianapolis on April 7, 1947, to Herbert E. and Elizabeth Baumeister. The elder Herbert was an anesthesiologist and Elizabeth a homemaker. Herb was the oldest of 4 children. By all accounts, he had a normal, uneventful childhood. In his teen years, Herb seemed to change. His behavior grew odd. Those who knew him mentioned that he seemed preoccupied and perhaps even obsessed with death and decay. He would leave the carcasses of dead animals on his teachers' desks at school. He started to fail classes. Herb's teachers contacted his parents, who'd also noticed disturbing changes in their eldest son. They had him evaluated by a psychiatrist who diagnosed Herb with schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. However, it seems he was never treated for either of these mental health issues. Despite his issues in school, Herb graduated from North Central High School in 1965. He was accepted to Indiana State University. At Indiana State University, Herb chose anatomy as his major, but he never graduated. His enrollment from 1965 through 1970 was sporadic. At ISU, Herb met his future wife, Julie. Julie was a sophomore at ISU when she and Herb met during school preparations for the Rose Bowl. She said they truly enjoyed each other's company and had fun together. Though it was the 60s, the hippie era, she and Herb were not really part of that scene. They liked to drive around together. Herb had hoped to become a doctor like his father, and although he tested with above average intelligence, he was never consistent with school. In November of 1971, Herb married Juliana Sater. In 1972, he went to Butler University for a semester. He didn't graduate from there either, but when he applied later for a job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, he stated he had a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology. He was hired as a temporary clerk typist at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and he worked there until 1985. Co-workers of Herb's reported several strange incidences that happened while he was working at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. One report included him urinating on a supervisor's desk. Another said that he kept a cake in a file cabinet for a long period of time so that he could watch it decay. Several coworkers also said that he began ranting and raving for no apparent reason at different times at work. Although he was not fired when he was caught urinating on his boss's desk at work, he was later terminated when he urinated on a letter addressed to the governor of Indiana. Herb also worked for a period of time as a copy clerk at the Indianapolis Star and the Indianapolis News. A coworker at the newspaper remembered Herb offering to drive a group of coworkers and friends to a football scrimmage at Indiana University in his hearse. He turned on the siren so they could get there quickly. They all thought it was funny. Gary Donna, an advertising executive who worked for the paper, remembered that Herb was, quote, sensitive about the way he was viewed and treated by those above him. He wanted to be somebody, and he dressed well and was eager, but he just never really fit in. Despite Herb's strangeness, him and Julie were doing quite well. She quit her job as a high school journalism instructor in the late 1970s, and they started a family. They had 3 children, Marie in 1979, Eric in 1981, and Emily 3 years later. After Herb lost his job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, Julie returned to teaching to help support the family. Herb began working at a thrift store, and he worked at the thrift store for 3 years. During his time there, he realized that he and Julie could successfully operate their own thrift stores. In 1988, they borrowed money from Herb's mother. His father had passed away at that time, and they opened their own store, which they named Save-A-Lot. They worked with the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis, a charity which benefited low-income families. The Save-A-Lot thrift stores thrived in the beginning, and Herb and Julie soon opened a second store, and later they would open a third store. Their success allowed the family to purchase an upscale home in 1991. The home was located in Hamilton County, Indiana, 20 miles from Indianapolis. It was a large two-door style home located on 18.5 acres and named Fox Hollow Farm. The house had an indoor swimming pool and riding stables. It was a dream home and a seemingly perfect life. Julie described Herb as a man with family-oriented values who was very involved with their children. She said their relationship wasn't romantic per se. It was more focused on the love of their family. On the outside, their life appeared idyllic, but you had only to pass through the doors of the sprawling mansion to see that appearances could be deceiving. Friends and family described the Fox Hollow farmhouse as unkempt and cluttered. The property became overgrown. The thrift stores that started out as tidy and thriving became messy and disorganized. In the summers, Julie took the children and went to Lake Wawasee nearly every weekend to stay with Herb's mother at her home there. Herb rarely ever accompanied her, stating that he had business dealings at home. Other issues existed in the marriage, and Julie would later say that she and Herb only had sex 6 times in their 25 years of marriage. Despite the issues, Julie never had an inkling that Herb was hiding dark secrets. Although a big tip-off would come in the winter of 1994. Her son Eric was playing in the backyard of the house at Fox Hollow Farm. He found a human skeleton and picked up the skull, showing it to his mother. Julie was shocked and followed Eric to the location of the skeleton. In a later interview, she said the skeleton looked as if a person had just laid down on the ground and died. When Herb got home that evening, Julie told him about the startling discovery. Herb was unsurprised. He explained simply that the skeleton had belonged to his father, the late anesthesiologist. It had been a medical school skeleton, and Herb had found it in the garage and placed it in the woods to get it out of the house. Although the finding unsettled her, Julie believed Herb's explanation for the bones. So let's flip back. Herb Baumeister has finally shown up on the radar of Indianapolis investigators thanks to the tip by the man Mark, who had been taken to Herb's farm and strangled in the pool. Detective Mary Wilson with the Indianapolis Police Department, along with Lieutenant Thomas Green, went to speak with Herb at his Save-A-Lot store on Washington Street. They'd been researching him for a while, ever since the license plate information came in. And while he seemed like an unlikely serial killer, he did actually fit the FBI profile in many ways. Mary Wilson immediately informed Baumeister why they were there. She said they were investigating the disappearances of several young men in Indianapolis. Herb was obviously nervous. When Wilson requested to search Herb's farm, he refused and said if they wanted anything further, they'd need to speak to his attorney. After the encounter, Green told Mary Wilson that he thought Herb was not only, quote, nervous beyond belief, but also, quote, one of the weirdest guys I ever saw. Mary Wilson was not to be deterred. She approached Herb's wife, Julie, at Fox Hollow Farm. As a part owner of Fox Hollow, Julie could also give investigators permission to search the property. However, Julie was shocked by the detective's allegations that Herb was involved in the disappearances of young men. Julie refused the detective or any investigator access to the property. Wilson gave Julie her card and asked her to please call call if she felt compelled. Life at the Baumeister house had never been perfect, but this period of time begins a steady decline in the lives of Julie and Herb. Not only were they both aware that Herb was being investigated for potential involvement in the disappearances of young men, but their stores had begun to suffer financially, and they too were struggling to pay their bills, including their payments for Fox Hollow Farm. As tensions rose, Julie called Mary Wilson and screamed at her, quote, "The police are not coming to my home, tearing through things, upsetting my children, all on the word of a psycho whom my husband never even heard of." This is referring to Mark, the man who alleged that Herb, under the alias Brian Smart, took him to Fox Hollow Farm and strangled him with a pool hose. Still, investigators felt they were on the right trail. Since they couldn't search the property, they did an air search from a helicopter using infrared equipment in an attempt to locate decomposing bodies. Unfortunately, they were unable to find anything substantial. As Herb's behavior grew stranger and their financial situation more dire, Julie decided to file for divorce in 1996. Employees were complaining about Herb frequently going off the deep end and ranting at employees. He was also disappearing from the stores for hours at a time, and his whereabouts were unknown. Julie was also feeling more and more concerned about the investigation surrounding Herb, the allegations by Detective Mary Wilson that he had been involved in homosexual homicides, and just Herb's increasing erratic and paranoid behavior. Herb also mentioned to Julie during this time that they should be very concerned about a man named Mark, which is the person that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, who Herb took back to Fox Hollow Farm, and in all likelihood was one of Herb's only surviving victims, or was his only surviving victim. And Herb had, in fact, which I didn't mention earlier in the podcast, he had, in fact, reached out to Mark at some point after that first encounter at his home, and they had even planned to meet again, and Herb never ended up showing up for that date. By 1996, Julie had started to fear Herb, and that was around the time that she decided to file for divorce. Herb ended up taking off in June of 1996 out of the blue with their teenage son, Eric. He took him to his mother's condominium at Wawasee Lake. Julie contacted her attorney and told him to reach out to Detective Mary Wilson. She invited them to Fox Hollow Farm, and when they arrived, Mary Wilson, along with a couple of colleagues, Julie told them about the strange experience of her son Eric finding a skeleton in the woods behind the house. They were apprehensive and maybe even a little skeptical, although Mary Wilson was not. She had pretty much become convinced that Herb was behind the killings of these gay men who had vanished. They asked Julie to show them where the skeleton had been found. At this point, Julie gave them permission to go ahead and search the property as well as the house. Julie then led investigators to the place on the property where her son had found the skeleton. It was summer in Indiana, so the forest was overgrown, and at first nothing appeared amiss. However, as the men began to kick at the undergrowth, they spotted a charred bone. Then they began to notice more bones and fragments of bones. Julie's attorney looked down and realized he could see teeth in the overgrown grass. At this point, Julie got scared that Herb was at Lake Wawasee with her son, and so she asked detectives to go and pick them up. Under the ruse of a custody dispute, investigators went to the condominium of Herb's mother and retrieved Eric. And at first, Herb was resistant, and Eric was not very happy being taken away from his father. However, ultimately, Herb let him go without a fight, and they did not apprehend Herb at this time. As investigators searched the Fox Hollow farm property, they continued to find more pieces of charred bone, but they still weren't entirely sure if they were human or not. Wilson gave bags of evidence, including pieces of burned bone, to the forensic anthropologist Stephen Naraki at the University of Indiana. He told her right away that not only were they human bones, but they were recent bones. This confirmation pretty much launched a full-scale investigation. The police returned to Fox Hollow Farm the following day, and they continued to find more and more fragments of bone. In addition to law enforcement, other county officials joined what was clearly becoming an enormous crime scene. Sonia Learcamp, a prosecuting attorney, attended the investigation, as did Stephen Naraki, the forensic anthropologist, along with two of his assistants. The group combed the Fox Hollow Farm property, placing orange flags in any space they found a fragment of bone. Within a half hour, they had placed nearly 100 orange flags. Investigators also began searching within Baumeister's residence. They saw the things that Mark had described, the informant who had been taken to Herb's house. And in addition to the pool and the strange mannequins that Mark had noted in the basement, police also found a partially hidden video camera. They wondered if he'd used the camera to tape his crimes. You might be wondering where Herb was in the midst of all this, so let me explain. When investigators picked up Eric from Herb at Lake Wawasee, they didn't want to tip him off about the search. Although they were finding bodies, bones on his property, they didn't yet have proof that he had murdered anyone. So they were afraid if they picked him up, he'd likely get to walk free before they could gather enough evidence to hold him. Thus, the decision was made not to apprehend him when they picked up Eric. The search grew in scope, soon encompassing more than 60 volunteers, including firemen and off-duty police officers. Bones were located beneath garbage and compost burn piles. Within the first few days of the search, hundreds and then thousands of teeth, bones, and bone fragments had been found on Fox Hollow Farm. Naraki, the forensic anthropologist, estimated this made up about 4 bodies. However, the search had not yet ended. In fact, it was about to grow. The bones appeared as if the bodies had been simply discarded in the woods and allowed to decompose. Later, they were covered in gasoline and burned and then scattered. 2 teenagers from the farm next door approached investigators on Fox Hollow Farm. They asked the police what they were looking for, and police told them that the farm was a crime scene and they were looking for bones. The teenagers quickly told them that the bones were in the creek. Unsure of what to make of this claim, searchers followed the teens to the west side of the property. The anthropologist and his assistant, as well as other investigators, were shocked by the quantity of bones, and most of them were human. Naraki said, quote, "It looked like a bomb went off in a people factory." Large, intact bones were actually sticking up from the mud. As searchers dug, they uncovered cans of Miller Genuine Draft, Herb's beer of choice, and pairs of handcuffs. The bones were strewn all along the creek bed and up the embankment. The pile along the creek would come to be known by investigators as the, quote, mulch pile. The teens had simply assumed the bones belonged to animals. Investigators later theorized that the creek was where the first murder victims were dumped. However, as the killer grew more confident from continually getting away with his crimes, not to mention lazy, he started to leave them closer and closer to his house. The closest set of remains was located within 50 feet of the back door of Fox Hollow Farm. The process of identifying victims would be painstaking and not entirely successful. Bones of at least 11 hands were discovered, which meant that there were at least 11 victims who had been discarded on the property. DNA samples had to be taken from victims' families. The cost of DNA in 1996 was very expensive and had to be paid by the families rather than law enforcement, which frankly I don't understand. And many of the families of potential victims simply didn't have the money to have their DNA tested. In total, the remains of 8 individuals were identified, but this would take years. So this is the final count as of today in 2020. At the time, I believe they were only able to identify 4. At some point, news of the search was leaked to the local press, and in all likelihood, Herb Baumeister realized his days of freedom were numbered. He packed a few items and climbed into his Buick, heading north through Detroit, Michigan, and into Canada. He phoned his brother and asked him to wire him some money. At some point, he pulled over and took a nap. A Canadian mounted police officer woke him up and told him he had to move on. The officer also noticed a great many videotapes in the back seat of Herb's car. Herb drove off. Eventually, he ended up at Pinery Provincial Park on the shores of Lake Huron. He sat down in a picnic area and wrote a suicide letter, apologizing for the financial ruin in his family and citing his impending divorce as some of the reasons for his suicide. He also apologized that he would be leaving a mess in such a beautiful spot. He mentioned he'd loaded only 1 bullet in his gun, so if a child came and found the gun after he killed himself, the child would not be able to hurt themselves. He ended the note saying he was going to eat a peanut butter sandwich and go to sleep. He mentioned nothing about the murders. Herb put the gun to his forehead and pulled the trigger. Herb Baumeister had committed suicide on July 3rd, 1996. Eventually, investigators from the United States went to Canada to retrieve evidence as well as Herb's car. The videotapes that the Canadian officer had noticed in the back seat of Herb's car were never located. Julie and her children, who were still at Fox Hollow Farm, were informed of Herb's suicide. They were devastated to learn of his death. Despite the stunning news of Herb's horrific secret life, he'd still been a doting father, and his wife and children were heartbroken at his death. And I think this can seem strange to some people, but the reality is that Herb, like many of these prolific serial killers who get away with murdering for such a very long time, their lives are so compartmentalized that the people closest to them genuinely have no idea this other side exists. So even as they're grappling with the terrible reality of who this person was on some level that they'd loved, there is still, in Julie's case, 25 years of memories and having children and getting married and falling in love. And that's even more challenging for his children because they truly would be removed from this other aspect of their father. And he's, after all, their father, and they loved him. And by all accounts, he was a good dad. In the end, 11 bodies were found at Fox Hollow Farm, though in reality, there could be many more than that. These included both of the men whose mothers originally reached out to the private investigator in 1994, 28-year-old Alan Broussard and 33-year-old Roger Goodlett. Also identified were 26-year-old Stephen Hale, 20-year-old Richard Hamilton, 31-year-old Manuel Resendez, 46-year-old Michael Kern, 20-year-old Johnny Bayer. and 31-year-old Jeff Jones. It's also very likely, and at this point assumed by investigators, that Herb Baumeister was the I-70 strangler, and he was responsible for murdering an additional 9 young men along the I-70 and I-35 corridors in Ohio and Indiana. And many of these men came from downtown Indianapolis or disappeared from downtown Indianapolis. And the investigators of those murders considered the cases closed at this point because the MO is very similar to what they believe he was doing at Fox Hollow Farm. These were young men that were picked up in the predominantly gay areas in Indianapolis. They were partially nude usually, which implies some kind of a sexual component to the murders. Most of them were strangled, and then they were dumped in rural areas along the side of the highway, often in streams. There's also a very obvious connection between the shift in the murders. The I-70 strangler essentially stopped dumping bodies in the early 90s, and this time frame coincided with the purchase of Fox Hollow Farm by Herb and Julie and his shift to dumping bodies at Fox Hollow Farm. Unfortunately, Herb's suicide closed the door on much of the information police might have gleaned about the murderer and the undiscovered victims. In the years since his suicide, coworkers and friends have spoken about Herb's seemingly dual personalities. One as a family man who was tidy and organized and devoted to his wife and children, and the other as a hothead with mood swings who cruised gay bars and had a desire to appear much grander than he was. In an attempt to talk about all of the victims of Herb Baumeister, I'm just going to go through the names, and I don't know, we don't know without a doubt if he murdered all of these people. Again, his suicide really made it very difficult for investigators to say definitively how many people he murdered, but these are the people he is suspected of having murdered. Authorities believe Herb's first victim occurred when Baumeister was just 28 years old, and he was a new father himself with a 7-month-old son. It was June 1980 when he potentially strangled Michael S. Petrie and left his nude body in a drainage ditch in White River Township. The next murder occurred in July of 1982. Maurice Taylor was found strangled along the Tipton-Hamilton County line. Next came Michael A. Riley, who was found strangled in June of 1983 in Hancock County. And this is the murder that police have the most evidence on connecting Herb to the I-70 stranglings, because after Herb Baumeister committed suicide, a witness who had seen Michael Riley get into a car with a man years earlier, more than a decade earlier, recognized a picture of a young Herb as the man that Michael Riley had gotten into a vehicle with that night that he disappeared. Eric A. Roediger was found in Preble County, Ohio, partially dressed and also strangled. Michael A. Glenn was found in August of 1986 in Preble County. His hands had been tied with a ligature. James B. Robbins was found nude and strangled in October of 1987. Clay R. Boatman was found in August of 1990 in Preble County. Thomas R. Clevenger was found in Darke County, Ohio, nude. His cause of death was undetermined. Again, the victims that were found on the property included Manuel Resendez, Alan Broussard, Jeff Jones, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale, Roger Goodlett, Mike Kieran, and Johnny Bayer. Alan Livingston and Jerry Williams Comer are also both young gay men who disappeared from Indianapolis and whose bodies were never found, and they are suspected to have been murdered by Herb Baumeister. And just to talk a little bit about some of the victims, there was an interview with Rose, the mother of Johnny Bayer, who was 20 when he was murdered by Herb Baumeister. He'd gone to work a shift at McDonald's and never came home. She said that she still has her son's McDonald's uniform hanging in her home. She said in this interview, quote, "Coping with all this has been like hell, but I'm learning to deal with it better." And I just think it is really important, especially in cases like this, to remember that behind every single one of these victims, there is a family. There are parents and siblings and children and friends and coworkers. There are so many people who are affected. One of the men who has never been found, Williams Comer, his companion Ray, was so frustrated by the disappearance of his partner that he even consulted a psychic, and she had told him that Williams Comer was alive. Now, if Williams Comer was one of Herb Baumeister's victims, he would have been one of the last victims that we are aware of, because he disappeared in August of 1995. Another unnerving aspect to Herb's crimes is that he used aliases when he was at these downtown Indianapolis bars. So we know he used Brian Smart when he met Mark. He also used the alias Michael Kieran, which is the name of one of the deceased men that was found on the Fox Hollow farm property, which is quite disturbing. It's interesting when you consider this case and all of the people that were investigating the disappearances of these men and the murders of the earlier men, and the reality, strangely and scarily, is that the reason the police were able to connect Herb Baumeister is because of Mark. Not only going to Herb's house that night and having that experience and contacting police, but because he later had a friend go out and get that license plate number. And it is a little terrifying to imagine how long he might have been able to get away with murdering these young men. That pretty well wraps up the case of Herb Baumeister and the murders that he allegedly committed and the bodies that were found at Fox Hollow Farm. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, I'm going to do another episode next week, which is going to be the second part to this podcast, which is all about the hauntings at Fox Hollow Farm that people have experienced in the years since Herb Baumeister was found to have murdered all of these men. I just want to make a quick apology for the quality of today's recording. I didn't realize until after I had done most of the recording that it's uncomfortably loud in some parts. So I apologize for that. I really don't have a very professional podcast setup. At one point I had a room that I was using, and now I record in my bedroom. And I just hope that the cat doesn't decide to scratch anything in the middle of it. Thanks so much for listening to the Bitter Endings podcast today. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.